Under the supervision of Pauline Lerevoir and Francois Gimen, the students from HEC explored innovative solutions in the business field to promote more sustainable transportation offers. They looked at the new business models that are emerging across the globe, offering mobility solutions that are more affordable, scalable, and sustainable. Representing HEC, I am pleased to welcome Sasha Krajcik.
Thank you, Cecilia. Mobility is central to our lives and makes up a significant portion of our carbon emissions. In France, the transport sector accounts for 29% of our GHG emissions, of which 53% are accounted for by personal vehicles. Besides, 41% of car trips are done with the driver alone. Tremendous emissions could be avoided by leveraging car sharing to minimize such trips. And this is just one of many examples which highlights the need to rethink our current mobility paradigm. As students in our 20s, we do not want less mobility, nor a certain form of sufficiency regarding our travels. And it's quite the opposite, as we want to be able to easily travel, to visit new cities, and to move around in our country and around the world. The disconnect between our current mobility models and the environmental and social urgency calls for a necessary mobility transition. We need to nudge individuals and consumers towards a different way of perceiving and consuming mobility. My team and I identified 3 areas of focus. First, the growing demand for services. Personal ownership of mobility devices is decreasing as consumers prefer solutions such as renting or leasing. And globally, the mobility as a service market, which represents a move towards service-based transportation, is expected to grow almost 4-fold in less than a decade, reaching $500 billion by 2030. This creates a huge opportunity to transform business models and value creation approach for both consumers and companies. We believe that innovative business models, which will make sustainable alternatives to private vehicle ownership more accessible and also financially attractive, will be the cornerstone of the transition. Second, we looked at intermodality. Tackling this issue is critical to the mobility transition because people want to be able to easily commute from point A to B, regardless of whether they start by renting a bike, then taking a train, and finally renting a car for the last part of the trip. Intermodality is key to facilitating sustainable mobility. And the third focus is the sharing economy. This will be central to accommodating the growing mobility needs of our planet, as it allows us to maximize and really optimize the use of existing transportation devices. The sharing economy allows us to do more commuting, more traveling with fewer resources, resulting in reduced environmental impact and an enhanced mobility accessibility. So to tackle the needed mobility transformation, leaders of the mobility ecosystem must rethink how they create value, both economically and for society, shifting the focus from ownership of mobility devices to the use of mobility services. So how willing are companies, public leaders, civil society to collaborate to rethink the value equation and design the right mobility ecosystem, one tailored to local constraints and opportunities?
Thank you for those questions, Sasha, and for that wonderful research. Can you please kick off this round with your question for Matthias?
Yes. Our research suggests that a shift in demand from owning mobility assets, such as cars, to buying mobility services is underway. So what does the mobility sector need to do to prepare themselves for the shift in their business model?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting analysis and the important questions. And building on this, I actually thought I want to talk about the elephant in the room for sustainable transportation. Electric cars, car sharing, intermodality, and sustainable business models, They are all great, but they're not enough, especially in developed countries. I think the true challenge is reducing car dependence and also reducing the number of cars. Research shows achieving climate targets in wealthy nations will only be possible if most transports shifts to public forms of collective mobility, in particular in cities and suburban areas. Overcoming car dependence means giving public space back to other mobility modes, from affordable and convenient trains to trams to bicycles and buses. Redesigning our cities to make this possible, and it means curbing the overconsumption of mobility by the rich. You might ask, why this focus on sufficiency and less? Firstly, studies show that mobility is the most unequal form of energy use. Large cars, frequent trips, and constant flying create a massive burden. The top 1% of global emitters were responsible for nearly a quarter of the total growth in pollution between 1990 and 2019. And a large part of this is due to transport emissions. Secondly, most efficiency improvements by the car industry, also the growth of the sharing industry, are in fact cancelled out by more cars driving longer distances. This is called the rebound effect in economics research. And third, while new technologies are key, they are not the main challenge. We urgently need to shift the debate, also I think the debate here, from focusing mainly on technological innovations and new business models to one focusing on the need for systemic infrastructure changes and social innovations that lead to reductions in overall demand for transport services. This is the real challenge. And even the IPCC acknowledges this need for demand management and sufficiency. So basically the bottom line, sustainability means that companies need to produce and sell not just different cars, but eventually also less cars, at least in wealthy countries. We need thriving public transport, car-free cities, and functioning public mobility services. Also in the countryside, obviously, some cars. But overall, this means less cars. That's the true paradigm shift. And I want to end this with a question, also maybe to Carlos. What if there is no sustainable business case for car manufacturers? Basically, no way to continue making profit while not further transgressing planetary boundaries. What would you do then?
So Carlos, you want to jump in on that one?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, Matthias, I could agree with many things you said, but I think there is one thing you need to think about is how you get the support of the people to get the transformation that you were describing done. I think all of the things that you would like to do need the support of the people. And perhaps not everybody is as conscious as you are vis-à-vis the problem that we are trying to fix. So please think about how to change the lifestyle of people with their support. And of course, you mentioned that, and I think it is absolutely correct. There is a big difference between the urban areas and the rural areas, very complete different kind of lifestyles and problems. But I would like to come back to what was said by our friend from HEC in Paris. We have recently bought from two German car makers a car sharing business, and we tried to run this car service car sharing business at zero, which means no profit. It was very hard because it was making a significant amount of losses, and that's why the two German car makers sold it to us, and we fixed it. Now it's fixed, and we have 50%, 50% market share of the car sharing services in Europe right now. What did we learn from that? We learned that there are 4 conditions to improve the sustainability of this car sharing, which I believe is a good step in the right direction, as we can, of course, use zero-emission vehicles for that specific service that was requested by the next generation. First, we need free parking from the cities, which should not be a problem, but actually it is right now. We need competitive energy, which should not be a problem. Actually, it is with the local town halls. We need a reasonable insurance, which should not be a problem, but actually it is, because we have a lot of destruction problems and lack of security in the urban areas where the cars get significantly damaged. At the end of the day, it would be absolutely possible very quickly to have a very sustainable, very cost competitive car sharing, zero emission service in the urban areas. And that's what we are doing with 50% market share. If we were able to convince our political leaders and the town halls of our cities to provide parking, competitive energy, reasonable security so that the insurance fees would be cost competitive. With those three conditions, we can do a great service to the young generation in terms of mobility. But as you mentioned, it is mostly focused on the cities. And the last comment I would share with you is very simple. Today, we are making cars, but we are trying to deliver freedom of mobility to our citizens. And as it was said by Cecilia, a freedom of mobility that is safe, clean, and affordable. Tomorrow, if you want us to do something else, just let us know. We are here to serve. We are not addicts to cars. We are just here to serve the needs of mobility from our citizens. And if you prevent the citizens from being mobile, I think you are going to face a certain number of issues on your side. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Carlos. And I think in this conversation, we keep coming back to it could be affordable. We've got to work together. We talk about all the different players that need to work together. Roberto, when we think about some of these solutions, there's a major cost, particularly an infrastructure cost, that someone has to pay for us to make this shift. So what's your take on that aspect?
Thank you, Cecilia. This comes back to some issues that I have already raised. If you were to make major investments in terms of infrastructure, I don't think that investment should focus on private vehicles. We have to think about a widespread dissemination of public transportation where public transportation does not exist. We have to have major investments in infrastructure for intermodality where it does not exist. I don't think we have to have major investments to provide more mobility for those that already have a lot of mobility. So that's why I'm a little bit disappointed to hear that our colleagues from France in their early 20s, they're thinking about more mobility and not less mobility. They want to fly more. It's impossible for a world with 8 billion people, if everyone wants to fly more, we're not going to make it. We have to think about flying less. So I think the real issue here is how to invest in public transportation, intermodality, and for that we need new business models. We don't need new business models for private ownership of cars. This is not the reality of the world. As of today, we have 1.6 billion cars in the world. 2/3 of that are only in 4 places: Europe, US, China, and Japan. The rest of the world does not have access to private mobility. We have to have major investments in public transportation.
Thank you for that. Majora, why don't you jump in on this conversation?
Sure. I mean, I'm just thinking about, okay, the echo's really bad in my ear. So sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, great. So what I'm struck by is that I think we need like both a carrot and a stick approach to this idea, because it's not going to be business is going to save us, but they can certainly help. And sometimes it means that you have to stop things before they get going. Like I'm just thinking of one of my heroes, Enrique Peñalosa in Bogota, Colombia, and how, basically, since he knew that so much of the city's infrastructure was going specifically to support wealthy car owners, which was a minority of people in Bogota, and so what he did was outlaw cars. I mean, literally parking on some of the major streets. That actually created a whole another type of business, which was private parking. It's like, you want your car? Fine, you pay for your car. But we, as a city, we should not have to be paying for all of that comes from having your car stolen or paying for your parking and all sorts of things. So again, inconveniencing folks a little bit also created a business, but then he was able to pump a lot of money specifically into ciclovia or bus traffic transit and greenway infrastructure for the bulk of the people that lived in Bogota that were making less than $2 a day. Like that is the kind of both like public private beautiful things that actually can help create the kind of nudges that can produce behavioral change, but also can produce business change. And I think we have to be a lot more creative about thinking about what are new opportunities that could be out there that are sitting right in plain sight, that literally make it so that we're the ones pushing the ideas and also policies that they can be much more transformative into a much more sustainable energy and transportation economy for all.
Thank you for that. So, Majora, you're the second person in this segment to talk about changing people's behaviors. So we've got a great question that came up around, and Matthias, you mentioned this earlier, the rebound effect. So what can be done to manage people's tendency to cancel out the environmental gains by consuming more transportation services as they observe each trip's decreased sustainability impact? So, Roberto, why don't you take that one, since you did comment about our need for less flying and things of that nature. Why don't you start us off on that one?
Yeah, this issue of the rebound effect is really a problem that has been studied for many years now. As we make things cheaper, more accessible, we create demand. And again, we have to have in mind that the big picture here is that we have a climate emergency here. Would be great if everyone could fly more, travel more, eat more, to have a private car, bigger and bigger. But this is not the reality of the world today. We're talking about a world that is heating up, major disruptions in cities, agriculture, poor people. They are going to be the ones that are going to be most affected. So it's very complicated to think about a solution to improve the life of those that already have a good life, and creating problems that those that have never benefited from that good life. So that's why we have been so critical about this issue of mobility. The real problem of mobility is the mobility poverty in some places, and not, let's say, making life easier for those that already have easy access for the private car. Private cars have to be end in the very short term, and we really have to think about public transportation, because more and more populations are moving to big cities where we are not going to have space for cars, etc. So again, I think the real discussion here is how to solve the transportation problem and not to provide more cars for people.
So, Manal, there's an opportunity to think about educating people. So one of the things from a rebound effect is people maybe not understanding the breadth of the impact that they may be having on the environment. How do we think that AI solutions might help along those dimensions?
First of all, I would like to mention kind of a new business model that could be adopted in terms of mobility where AI can play a big role to enhance all the mobility needs of the 8 billion people inhabitants. So if we think as mobility as a service platforms that combine multiple modes of mobility into one platform, where users can whenever they want to make a journey, AI can optimize the journey and provide the optimal modes of transportation that they should take in order to complete that journey, and also displaying perhaps the carbon footprint of their choices within that platform. So AI can, in this case, provide accessibility to optimal journeys and pathways and modes of communication to users at any point in time. AI can integrate data from various sources into the platform, from traffic data to weather data to even real-time data from other users, and optimize for any particular user the mobility option that he or she can take in order to complete that journey. So in that case, people may automatically opt away from using their private cars and prefer to use a platform that facilitates or personalizes experiences for them, right? So instead of forcing people not to use their private cars or stopping manufacturing cars, we should provide them with better options, right? Better options within these platforms that also integrate green technologies, electric vehicles, bikes, ride shares, taxis, public transportation. And with the availability of these platforms, we will be able to gather tremendous amount of data from all the users of the platform. So we will have valuable mobility data that will inform policymakers to improve infrastructure, where AI can use in order to prioritize availability of services to certain regions where high demand is available. So automatically, the availability of the big data and with the integration of the AI technologies, we will be able to, improve the accessibility to mobility to everybody, and ultimately reduce the carbon emissions and allow for more sustainable solutions and guide people towards picking the right options in terms of mobility solutions rather than simply imposing it on them.
So thanks for that, Manal. You bring up this point of intermodality, and I want to get to that in a moment, but I want to give Matthias an opportunity. Since you brought up the rebound effect, I want to give you an opportunity to elaborate on this topic a bit. Matthias?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just very shortly, I think ultimately the solution to rebound effects kicking in is to impose some form of limits. And I think we often think of limits as something negative, but we can also see limits as a project of collective self-determination, where we as humanity give ourselves limits that enable long-term thriving on this planet. And I think this is key on many dimensions, and we like to make it very concretely. I think, for example, for the issue of airplanes, we need to start with bans on certain types of technologies, for example, private jets, and working our way from there towards a general reorganization of the entire mobility sector. So firstly, addressing the excessive overconsumption by the very few and very rich, and then working our way towards more general forms of setting limits. And I think this could also be forms of limits on the size of cars that are normally allowed in cities, then maybe also creating more inner cities and then also entire cities where there's no cars allowed except for people who really need a car. But most of us could also be mobile without cars. And I think without limits, ultimately, rebound effects cannot be solved.
So very, very interesting perspective, Matthias, and thinking about those of us who really need cars. Carlos, why don't you jump into this discussion?
Well, thank you. I just would like to come back to what Manal was saying. When we see the capacity utilization rate of public transportation from one side, from the other side, the potential of car sharing and mobility services platforms, I do totally agree on the fact that we can improve with her comment enormously the way we are using those assets. The way we are using those assets is by far not optimal. And we can just through the crunching of data understand where those capacities should be put, in which area, at which time window should be using these tools to understand where the mobility need is, and therefore optimizing significantly not only the convenience, but also, of course, the emissions. And we have all seen many buses almost empty, making tours where there is nobody inside. We have seen crowded buses. We have seen everything. All of this just demonstrates that the assets that we already have are not being properly used in terms of capacity to maximize the convenience and reduce the emissions. So completely agree with Manal on the artificial intelligence potential. I think this is a very big direction for optimization on those mobility needs without emissions. Thank you.
So Carlos, a follow-up to this, and this is for you or whomever wants to jump in here. We are talking about public transportation, and we've had it for a while, yet we still have the issue that you just brought up about underutilized and inefficiently utilized assets. Has public transportation worked And what are we going to do to make that work as a solution for the future? So, Carlos, if you want to jump in
That's a
on that.
striking point you are making, Cecilia. If I may comment that, if public transportation was the right answer, and it may be, I'm not saying it's not, the question is, why didn't it work over the last 70 years? Why didn't public transportation work over the last 70 years? Because many attempts have been made, many investments have been made, many cities have tried, but most of them are failed. So it is true that the only thing that is new in the way we are using those assets right now is artificial intelligence. That is really new. That can really bring a different access in the way we are understanding the needs of the people and the way we are crunching the data and understanding where we should put the capacity and when to optimize convenience and reduce emissions. What is striking for me is that public transportation is something that we have been highlighting for the last 70 years. Yet, people still prefer to use their cars. So from one side, we have the capacity utilization, which is not optimal. From the other side, we have the security, the perceived security, and also the convenience. That's why I don't think that this can only be solved with regulations. I think it has to be a global social direction that everybody agrees on, and that we find the reasonable, good sense thing to do.
So thank you for that. And Matthias, why don't you hop in on this question as well?
Sure, thanks. So one point, public transportation works in many places. It does work very well. It doesn't work in other places, also because of many factors, but one factor is also the deliberate efforts by the car industry in the beginning of the 20th century to actually dismantle the existing public transportation system to create a market for their product. So I think we have to be quite honest about the real interests behind creating a car culture that has become hegemonic in our societies, where most people associate a good life with owning a private car. And I think this is not the real need people have is a need for mobility, not a need for a car. And this is a cultural shift that we need to address in order to enable this shift towards public transportation. And there's great examples in many European cities where public transportation does actually work for many and could work much better if there would even be less cars and there's more public space that people can actually start to reclaim their cities and for their communities, as Majora has already highlighted.
So thank you for that. It sounds like you are in agreement with Sasha on the idea of the young generations are not necessarily looking for car ownership, but for mobility. Majora, why don't you hop in on this as well?
Not agree with you more, and thank you for actually adding context and research to it, because I can see anecdotally how so much transit is not invested in. It's actually starting to become a thing here, in the States, as sort of transit-oriented development, for which I am utterly delighted. But, the same way that there was a marketing play, back when the cars were just like, look, we're going to be king. Literally communities were destroyed in the States and actually all over the world in order to make room for highways so that cars could drive on them. If that isn't an example of the kind of, like really bad practices, like creating policies that people have to deal with, I don't know what is. So I think the same thing can be said for how do we kind of make it so that that transit culture is something that we look forward to. As opposed, because how could that help us start to see that this is how we experience the great wide open. This is how we experience connectivity with people and within other parts of the world, even sometimes within our own communities. It is much about marketing. But it's about producing the behavioral change that makes people feel like this is what we need to see. It is. I think we have done really a very bad job of making transit attractive. I mean, I'll give you a silly little example, but on our regional rail system, we used to have a bar car, so you can get a drink on the way back and forth to wherever you're for home to your business. They don't have them anymore. I would personally think it'd be kind of great to have a bar car when I'm traveling out to my school to go where I teach, which is an hour away on transit. So I'm just saying it would be lovely.
Great, thank you for that. And you said that the move to put the highways in and support the car culture was a bad example. Maybe it's a good example of how to get your point across. Maybe if we take some of those tips and apply them to another objective, maybe. Roberto, how about you hop in on this one?
Yeah, very briefly, just to add to the discussion. Let's say over the past 50 years, we have been giving much more support to private cars than to public transportation. The more roads you build, the more parking lots you build, you create demand for the use of private cars. And once you have that in place, you do not go back. Let's take the example of the US. It's very hard for you to arrive in the US in an airport and have public transportation to go downtown. It's not the reality of Europe. So why, let's say, you have public transportation in Europe and you don't have that in the US? This has very much to do with the importance of the car industry in the US over time. So it's not true that public transportation does not work. What's true is that not too many incentives have been given to public transportation and a lot of incentives to private cars.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I want to briefly touch, because you all talked about it or around it. We did have some questions around this on the intermodality. So the question that we have is, what types of solutions can be devised to integrate the planning of trips that require the use of more than one mode of transportation to get from door to door? So, if you think about, Roberto, you just said, when I fly somewhere, then how do I get the rest of the way? So whether it's bikes, cars, planes, trains, automobiles, how do we actually think about the connectivity and the intermodality? I'll start with Matthias. Why don't you kick us off on this one?
Sure, thank you. So I would again put this in the context of a well-functioning public transportation system. And I think for this, there's a lot of need for investment. I don't think we know yet what a well-functioning, affordable public transportation system could look like that integrates intermodality, in particular regarding bikes. I think we have to be a bit careful about some of the newer solutions, such as the electric rollers that are congesting cities, are not really sustainable in terms of the resource use, only lasting on average 1 year. So I think there's also some false solutions in this under this aspect of intermodality, but integrating public transportation systems with well-functioning, you can take your bike, there's also public bikes for rent in the city, and integrating this with systems of car sharing in the suburban area and outside of the cities, in the context of some publicly provided right to mobility. I think this would be a good framework in which to discuss intermodality. On the other hand, we have to be careful. There's lots of efforts at the moment, I think, to create new markets for products in the niches of where people are currently using public transport and are then using some private services such as these rollers for the last mile that are actually not really beneficial for the entire communities, but rather a new business case. So there's some dangers, but I think there's great potential here as well.
Thank you for that. So as we wrap this segment up, there are a few things that I've heard us talk about. One, we said that we need to think broader than just cars. We understand that we have a car culture that has dominated the way we've made investments in the past, and it has dominated the culture and how citizens think about what their modes of transportation will be. If we are going to achieve more sustainable and affordable and accessible mobility for all, we're going to need to think of a broader set of solutions than just a car-dependent society. When we think about public transportation, it has worked in some areas, but not in others. Perhaps because it's not effective and we might use some AI and things like that to optimize it. But perhaps it's because we haven't marketed it and we haven't chosen to focus on that as a viable alternative solution. What's clear is that solutions that come out today, there may be confusion around whether or not they really are sustainable. And we've got a responsibility to think more critically about the options that we provide, how we inform people about the decisions they make, and where we invest our time, dollars, and resources in how we move. With that, let's move on to our third and last sequence.